Hold on.
Thanks, Zach.
There we go.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this American Promise speaker series. Once again, you are in the right place if that's what you're looking for, and we're just letting our guests into the webinar. We'll have Colin Woodard is with us, and we're looking forward to starting the conversation in just a minute as we let people get settled in. But welcome. Okay, we'll kick it off. And once again, hello, everyone. You are in the right place if you have signed up for the Leadership Speaker Series with special guest Colin Woodard this week. I'm Jeff Clements, CEO of American Promise. American Promise is uniting Americans to fix the number one solvable problem in America right now, the corruption of out of control money in politics and our elections. This conversation is the first in our 2024 American Promise Quarterly Speaker Series, which serves as a forum for highlighting the thoughts and ideas of innovators and thought leaders who are helping to renew the American project. And we're going to be talking, as I said, with Colin Woodard. He's the director of the Nationhood Lab at Salve Regina University's Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy, and a New York Times bestselling author. I'm going to share more about his introduction in just a moment, but let me tee up the conversation with our quarterly update very briefly about American Promise. And particularly, we're excited about this conversation because we're talking about America tonight. Today, we're talking about our history and the future of America, about what holds us together, what tears us apart, what makes us a nation. Few have dug as deep or as insightfully into those questions than Colin Woodard. And spoiler alert, there's a lot that tears us apart that he'll be talking about. And about the only thing that pulls us back together is our shared commitment to core beliefs of freedom, equal rights, government of the people. It's why it's so dangerous when Americans can't believe in that creed anymore. Without that belief and commitment, there's little that can define America as a nation. We'll be talking about that some more. And at American Promise, the context is particularly interesting and pertinent because, you know, we see the nonstop history of Americans amending the Constitution as markers of our commitment as a nation to that creed. And we believe we can only protect freedom, equality, and government of the people today with a constitutional amendment that protects equal speech, representation, free and fair elections, and ends the corrupt pay-to-play money in politics system we have now. Now, amendments are big lifts, we know that, but our work now is reaching a tipping point of the kind we've seen before in our history. 22 states now back the amendment. We've leveraged that drive much closer to the two-thirds vote we need in Congress. It's no easy task, but we're now seeing some unmistakable signs that the For Our Freedom Amendment is going to be part of the Constitution of the United States. We have 86% support in the country, demonstrated in Colin Woodard's home state of Maine in a November vote on a ballot initiative, 86%, upwards of 80% support across the spectrum over and over again. The Pew Research Center just released its usual survey of Americans' concerns. The top priorities, always at the top, the economy. Next, usually terrorism. After that, it could be a lot of different things. You know what it is now? Reducing the influence of money in politics. The number 3 priority, ahead of immigration, ahead of crime, ahead of budget, ahead of climate, ahead of serious concerns that Americans have. People get this problem, and they want a constitutional amendment to fix it. So many of you, so many Americans across the country have invested their hearts, minds, and wallets in getting American Promise to scale so we can get this across the finish line. I'm going to say some really quick points about where we are for you, and feel free to follow up with me. Breaking news from earlier today, our state-based model that helped put 22 states on the board had a success in Pennsylvania. The House State Government Committee voted 22-3 a key test vote in support of a resolution to endorse the For Our Freedom constitutional amendment and get Congress moving on it in the Pennsylvania delegation. 22-3. That's Democrats, that's Republicans. It's chaired by a Republican in Pennsylvania, one of the most divided states in the union at the moment, most partisan, and we are seeing lopsided votes for this constitutional amendment. Wyoming, we won a majority vote in the House last month. Wisconsin, cross-partisan resolution, demonstrated strong support, and the resolution has been voted out of committee in Minnesota and awaits a floor vote. And just in the last few months, Americans have sent nearly 4,000 emails to their members of Congress and state legislatures to get behind this. The winning vote will come out of Congress. It's a 2/3 vote. You can help make it happen. Our Congressional Affairs Director reports significant interest, but Congress needs to hear from us. So check out the way you can get involved at americanpromise.net. Sign up for the National Citizen Leadership Conference and Citizen Lobby Day that is coming in June. You can be there. You can meet with Congress. You can help make the next amendment to the United States Constitution. And so now let's begin. And I think after you hear Colin Woodard, you'll agree that we all need to really dig deep because there's some serious challenges structural to our country. And we've all seen that in recent years coming to a head. Let me say more, as I said I would, about Colin Woodard as the director of the Nationhood Lab at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University. That lab delivers more effective tools with which to describe and defend the American democratic tradition, to better understand and defeat the forces undermining it. He is the New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including one we're going to talk a lot about in a moment, American Nations, a history of 11 rival regional cultures in North America, and as well as American Character, and his book, Union, the struggle to forge the story of United States nationhood after the Civil War. He's a longtime foreign correspondent of the Christian Science Monitor, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Chronicle of Higher Education. He covered the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, ethnic conflict in the Balkans, war crimes trials in The Hague, climate change in the Antarctic. For Colin, Maine is a warm climate, I guess, after the Antarctic. So as a staff writer at Maine's Portland Press Herald, he won a George Polk Award and was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize there. His work has been featured by CNN, BBC, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, New York Times, many more. And he's a contributing writer and inspired a primetime NBC drama and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Ubisoft video game. I'm not a gamer, I confess, but that is impressive. Colin, thank you for being here. We're so grateful for your work and for your presence here in the conversation we're going to have today. Let's unpack first, as I said we would, your book, American Nations. It's an incredible insight. I remember reading it, like so many Americans, and just my eyes open to kind of what was right in front of us, but nobody could see until you really pulled it apart for us and showed that. I'm going to turn it over to you. I hope you'll share some slides and walk us through the nations of America as you see it, Colin.
Oh, my pleasure, Jeff, and thanks to American Promise for having me and to all of you who've logged in the audience. Yes, for those who don't know American Nations, it argues essentially that we're not one America, but several and always have been. And this is very important to the work that I do now because at Nationhood Lab, we, I guess, are trying to solve for the problems of United States nationhood. And this is one of the critical underlying features of the United States that makes us vulnerable to collapse and dissolution in a way that you wouldn't expect a large, successful superpower to have, makes us more vulnerable than many of our peer liberal democratic nations elsewhere. And so for those who aren't familiar with it, I'm going to share a screen with some slides because this is driven by maps and, well, picture is worth 1,000 words when it comes to maps. The central argument is that there are these different regional cultures. Our country is really divided into separate nations. And the different regional cultures tie back to the differences between the different colonial projects that took form on the eastern and southwestern rims of what's now the United States. You can see the eastern shore ones here. These cultures came at different times. They were settled by people with different ethnographic characteristics, different religions, different ideas about what the good life is, different economic systems. All the things that anthropologists think of as culture were different between, say, the early Puritans who came to Massachusetts Bay and thought themselves to be you know, a people in covenant with God, like the Old Testament Hebrews, and had been assigned to do certain things in the world, an errand in the universe, and that they would be punished or rewarded as a group. That's a completely different model than, say, the English people who came in roughly the same time period to the Chesapeake country, to what I call the Tidewater, who were instead the lesser sons of English colonial gentry, like the second and third and fourth and fifth sons, the ones who weren't going to inherit the manor at home. And so they came to the New World trying to create their own manors now that they could imagine the possibility of there being new land. So they were trying to replicate the sort of semi-feudal society they left behind, but thought of themselves as enlightened lords. And the backcountry was settled by Scots-Irish. The area around what's now New York City was Dutch. The Deep South was settled by English slave lords from Barbados, who perfected a slave system in the Caribbean and then transplanted it once they'd run out of land on their small island to the subtropical lowlands of the United States. These different cultures, some of them were all about ethnic diversity and pluralism. Others were all about being a specific Anglo-Protestant identity. Some valued democratic participation in politics. Others were modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. So they're very different cultures, and they each settled. This is in the Southwest. This is the area that Spain, south to north, successfully colonized before the U.S. annexations. And these cultures all expanded all the way through into the early 19th century in mutually exclusive settlement bands, colonizing their own strips of the continent, and in doing so, laying down their ideas about how the world ought to be governed, the institutional frameworks and underlying assumptions and ideals were quite different. And again, they didn't think in the colonial period that they were going to end up in a continent-spanning federation together, and yet they did. And that is created today. This is at a county level. These are the actual regional cultures in the country. And you can see the settlement patterns didn't follow state boundaries or even international boundaries. They bled over them, which is why people have arguments about what is the Midwest. Is Kentucky in or out? How about Missouri? Why is some states have a lot of cohesion? Minnesota, Maine, Idaho, and other states seem riven as if in separate, nations when you're in California, which is trying to have a Calexit and break up all the time, or Pennsylvania or Ohio. These are places where competing settlement streams colonize different strips that have never seen eye to eye or gotten along. And this has implications for everything today. I mean, I can't unpack all these nations for you, but the differences between them are pretty profound. There's a sort of communitarian grouping that asks, the big mission in the United States has always been, how do you create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free? And there's a big argument about that. Do you do it through promoting individual freedom, like our autonomy against the government and everyone else, and have low taxes and low regulation, and therefore we would be axiomatically free? Or are we trying to build a free community, cultivate a Republican citizenry? Is it a shared project where we need to reinvest in all the infrastructure that makes it possible for individual humans to be free, right? Those are two different ideas. And for instance, the greater New England heritage of Yankeedom, the Midlands, left coast, New Netherland, the Dutch settled area around New York City, are all communitarian. Then the individualistic nations, greater Appalachia, most of all, settled by Scots Irish from the war-torn parts of the British borderlands, Ulster, the lowlands of Scotland, the English Marches. These are people where government institutions had always been very weak. And when government showed up, it was usually a bunch of people with lances trying to mow down your family. You have to defend your kith and kin yourself. So, nothing good is to come of institutions. It's all about individual autonomy and keeping government and outside intrusions to a minimum. To a different extent and in a different way, the Deep South and Tidewater and Far West shared that, which has implications for almost any political question. To understand US politics, you can't look at red state, blue state maps. You have to look at county maps. You can see on this one, you can see in one color, almost all of Yankeedom's zone voting one way. You can see the left coast standing out against the interior of Washington and Oregon and California. You can see a monochrome in the Deep South and Tidewater and Greater Appalachia. And you can see that the Midlands area, the swing area in our politics, is mixed. And I haven't switched the colors. Red really is Republican and blue really is Democrat, because this isn't a recent presidential contest. This is the 1916 showdown between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Hughes. And parties come and go, right? This is the 2008 map, Barack Obama versus John McCain, which looks a lot like the 2012 map. And you can see that, in essence, the biggest change is the two parties have reversed positions in constituencies and regional orientations. Also, between 1916 and 2008, African Americans and Latinos were able to exercise the franchise. So you can see El Norte appear against the Far West and Deep South. And you can see that the Deep South and Tidewater are no longer monochrome in one political party. It affects dynamics within parties, usually in a presidential primary, right, where we finally have just a choice that everyone's making the same choice for office. Usually you have 20 people when the first states vote, and then there's 2 people or only 1 left by the time the last states vote. So you can't do a comparison across the country of who voted for who. One exception was the 2016 Democratic contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. And here you can see this is within the Democratic primaries that year. Green are counties that were won by Bernie Sanders and yellow by Hillary Clinton. And you can see to a large degree, essentially Sanders took Yankeedom and the left coast. The Midlands was mixed, and Hillary Clinton took the Tidewater, Greater Appalachia, Deep South, and El Norte. So it has effects even within political parties. It has effects within states. This is the 2022 midterms. These are the Senate race in California. And you can see that the Republican candidate actually won in the Far West section of California. And that was true both cities and rural areas. In the left coast and El Norte sections, the Democratic candidate won. So, the differences are quite large even within states. And I included on the left the county level results because you can see it's not just in aggregate. Look at the county level affinity to the settlement borders, which were defined from the 1850s, and the difference in the way that the colonization occurred in different parts of California. Same with Texas. This is the race between Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke for governor. You can see O'Rourke, the Democrat, actually won the El Norte section, but lost in the other 2 regions. In aggregate, by the way, Beto O'Rourke actually lost urban areas in Greater Appalachia and Deep South if you take all urban counties together. It affects things beyond politics, though. This at a county level, which we mapped at Nationhood Lab, is the prevalence of diabetes per capita. Red is bad, blue is good. You can see a quite enormous difference between the Deep South and Greater Appalachia and Yankeedom or Left Coast or New Netherland. These are credit scores, your average FICO score. Gold is good, blue is bad. You notice that, there's a regional variations there, and there's plenty of really, really poor counties in Yankeedom and the Midlands that have the gold color, and plenty of rich counties in those other regions that have blue. Why is this? I have no idea, but the regional pattern is pretty striking and follows the curve right into Ohio and other places between regional cultures. It affects your response, individual liberty versus common good, and responding to a deadly airborne virus. Those have immediate implications. And when COVID-19 hit, there were very dramatic differences both in public behavior and elected official behavior in what to do. This is the COVID vaccination rates in August 2021 at a time when the vaccine had been available everywhere if you wanted to get it, and everyone had time to do it. And you can see the vaccination rates in Yankeedom, it's almost double that of the Deep South. And not unrelated, the year before vaccines were available, is the per capita death rate from the New York Times per county. The darker it is, the more people per capita had died, and also where masking and other public health advice was often spurned by elected officials and the public. This is where the uninsured live for health insurance. Red and orange is bad, and the other shades are better. And you can see divides even within states like Missouri and Virginia and Louisiana match up with regional lines, even though insurance policy is set at the state level. It affects other things as well, like deadly gun violence. This is from the CDC data that we ran through Nationhood Lab is the per capita gun homicide rate for whites only. The national rate otherwise looks very similar as well. But the difference is absolutely enormous between the regions. I mean, you're talking a four-fold difference between Deep South and Yankeedom, and more like an 8 to 9-fold difference with New Netherland. This is life expectancy in years. You can see that the difference is 3 to 5 years at a population level between, say, Yankeedom or left coast and Deep South and Greater Appalachia, which is, the difference between the United States and, Bulgaria or the Philippines if you're getting towards 5 years. It's an enormous difference to see contained within one country. It affects the way people talk. This from an internet researcher named Rick Ashman are the major dialect areas today. He basically used the internet to have people call in and record saying the same statement, and then they did their linguist thing, diphthongs here and there, and categorized everybody where they are, not centuries ago, but now. And you can notice that in the dominant trends in those blue lines following to a great degree the settlement patterns that I described before, which when you think about it, makes a lot of sense. It also affected immigration. The great 1880s to 1924 immigration wave that so transformed American identity and politics and constituency was not evenly distributed across the map. The Census Bureau would ask people each year, are you foreign born or not? And that allowed one to get individual data and see per capita, where were the immigrants? This is the 1900 by county map. The darker the shading is, the more immigrants there were per capita. You may not be able to see the ledger really well, but the darkest ones are 30% or higher were immigrants going into those areas. The areas that are completely white had no foreign-born population, or it was under 1%. Now look at that. In essence, nobody from that wave went to Tidewater, the Deep South, and Greater Appalachia, almost following the exact settlement curve. The conditions there, neo-feudal often, ended up frustrating people who were coming precisely to escape feudal systems and try to get freehold land to farm. And so they didn't come into those areas, which meant that immigration wave didn't make places more alike. It increased the differences in experiences of identity and who was a real American and who belonged. But it also affected the religious landscape, right? See, the contours here are very similar to what you just saw. This is today the actual dominant religious denomination in each county in the U.S. Red is Southern Baptist. And you can see that whole area where you had a legacy Anglo-Protestant culture that in other regions, that great wave challenged those cultures. Suddenly, it was like you had to confront the idea that henceforth there were going to be Catholic and Jewish and Orthodox Christian people at least, and you would have to accept them as Americans. That didn't happen in the 1880s or the 1920s in some regions of the country because no immigrants went there, changing your general ideas about what was normal and what religion was normal, or even the idea that a particular religious tradition like white evangelicals might be the true religion of the American people and that the country was founded on that. An idea that just wouldn't work in other regional cultures because it was so obviously untrue on the ground. Blue, by the way, and this is Catholic, which was the largest group in that 1880s to 1924 immigration wave, and you can see the marker largely on the map today. And so those are the American nation's regional cultures in a nutshell with some of their implications today. And I just wanted to get that out there because the existence of these fissures make it very difficult for the country to maintain its unity, and it makes other things like having a shared story all that much more important.
Wow, fascinating. And I think sometimes it can sound, maybe, I'm just going to say it, kind of judgmental, especially if it's good, bad, at these patterns. But I think what one really picks up from your work is, in many ways, this is culture, and culture is incredibly strong, and sticky. So that in regions, even though there's been immigration, like you showed on your map, New England got a lot of immigration, and yet Yankeedom, as you would call it, remains. And so, and culture matters to people. It's important. And so, um, what are the implications with so many different cultures for dealing with crisis? I mean, and the biggest crack up, of course, was over slavery and the Civil War. But it seems, we are tending to think that we are uniquely divided today, or that the, hyper partisanship today is somehow unique to us. But take us through, like, what is the pattern of American history that shows the tension of these cultures actually entering kind of the, almost existential
Yeah.
state for the country as a country?
Well, think about it. I mean, how did these regional cultures finally wind up together? Because in the colonial period, even the early republic, people, when you ask them what country you're from, they'd say, I'm from Massachusetts, I'm from South Carolina. People weren't saying American unless they were like talking to a European and different, the way a French person would say, I'm European. It wasn't a declaration of your country yet. They ended up together because there was this threat in the 1770s from Britain. They were going to consolidate the empire, and that change in policy meant that the idiosyncratic ways of life and politics and structuring society institutions were all going to be changed and made to conform to a central model out of London. It threatened the power base and the way of life in each of these separate regional cultures. So they ganged together to stop it, and they had this ad hoc alliance to protect their own localities. And lo and behold, they won. But that meant that suddenly they found themselves in this thing called the United States together that had been created as a, sort of treaty organization to fight the war. And it had a, sort of shared military command in the form of the Continental Congress. But now they were a something, and nobody really knew for sure what it was. And even after the Constitution was put together, the present Constitution, it was still uncertain. People were still asking, are we an EU-like confederation of states that remain sovereign? Are we a NATO? Are we supposed to be a nation state in waiting, like Prussia or post-revolutionary France were? And if so, what holds us together? Because everyone knew they didn't have a shared history or ethnicity or religion or any of those things. Um, and so, ex post facto, we had to come up with an answer to what our nation was. We already had a state, but we didn't have a definition as to why it existed and who belonged and what it was for and where it was coming from and where it was going. So starting in the 1830s, two stories jump forward because they needed it. By the 1830s, the revolutionary generation had died off. So the idea of what holds us together is a shared struggle in the American Revolution isn't great, we won. That wasn't carrying the day anymore by the time the revolutionary generation wasn't around. But also there'd been secession movements. New Englanders had tried to leave during the War of 1812, parts of Appalachia during the Whiskey Rebellion. And the slavery wasn't going away as the founders thought it would. Instead, it was consolidating. And it was a difficult thing to square with the natural rights proposition in the Declaration. So two stories came forward to try to meld this together, because if they didn't come up with a story, they knew that all this was going to fall apart. And one was a sort of civic national story. It said, okay, we don't share an ethnography, a religion, a history, but we do share commitment to a set of ideals, the ones in the Declaration, our opening statement as a peoples, that people have, a God or universe granted, or granted by nature's God, right to live and to pursue happiness as they understand it, and to not be tyrannized, and access the representative self-government that makes it all possible, and that we're all in a covenant to protect one another's rights to these things. That was one version packaged by a Yankee New Englander named George Bancroft, who later was George Polk's Secretary of Navy, created the Naval Academy at Annapolis, gave the orders to naval captains that caused the annexation of California, later was our ambassador to London and Berlin. The point is, he wasn't just a guy who wrote histories and the most important historian of the first half of the 19th century. He was also a player in these things. But immediately after he put forward this idea and it started taking hold, there was a counter argument, and it came out of one of Bancroft's intellectual colleagues, a man named William Gilmore Simms from South Carolina, who with a group of Southern intellectuals said, no, that's completely wrong. Jefferson was incorrect. Humans are not created equal. In fact, the only people who could achieve the promises in the Declaration are the superior Anglo-Saxon race, meaning William Gilmore Simms and his friends. And that we're a set of ethno-states. And our purpose is to be the homeland of the Anglo-Saxon people. And together, the government acts as an umbrella to protect all of these virtuous Anglo-Saxon states from one another. It's an ethno-nationalist and inherently authoritarian argument modeled on classical republicanism, right? The democracies of ancient Greece and Rome, where a small minority has the liberty or the privilege to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. Republics can only exist that way, they argued. These were the two main strains, right? And that became an intellectual battle that quickly became the defining struggle of our history in the antebellum period, in the Civil War itself, during Reconstruction, during Southern Redemption, and all the way through, in a sense, to the present. The story of our history is a struggle for the soul of the country between this civic national definition and a more restricted ethno-national one. It's no longer was just Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but expanded, but there was always that battle. And guess which one finally won federation-wide a consensus in the 1910s and 1920s? The bad one, right? There was a time when the country really was governed on those principles, right? You had the triumph of Jim Crow laws. You had the 1924 Immigration Act passed specifically to create quotas to protect the Anglo-Saxon nature of the country. Birth of a Nation was all the rage, a movie celebrating the Ku Klux Klan's violent suppression of African Americans in the South. And, the creation and putting up of many of the Confederate monuments we're taking down now. My point is that the ethno-national narrative is not some sideshow or asterisk in our history. It's a powerful force, which is why it's always out there ready to loom up again, why there's a struggle for American democracy. These things don't, you don't maintain a liberal democracy magically. You have to fight for it, as Frederick Douglass knew, and Lincoln when he was at Gettysburg, and MLK at the Mall. These are all those arguments over that fight over what's going to define the United States. And for our country, is a really important thing to do.
So there you have it, folks. Those are the stakes. You have to fight for it. The struggle goes on. The choice isn't obvious which is going to result. And we're talking with Colin Woodard, Pulitzer Prize finalist, author of American Nations, and author of Union and many other books. I want to turn to Union. You took us right past a big victory for a national creed of freedom and self-government and equal rights that came at great cost to the country, of course. But your book Union talks about the effort to actually have a positive national story. Our friend Greg Blonder asked in the chat, what is it that crosses these regional lines? What issues can hold us together? Let's unpack Union a little bit and the story that held us together once and might do so again, Colin.
Yeah, so I've touched on that battle. So Union tells the story of that effort to create a narrative from scratch for the United States, a national story that would define us, and that battle between those two visions. Both, the one first packaged by Bancroft and the one first packaged by Simms, and the battle all the way through to the 1920s between those. And the stakes are so important because, for lack of those other things, the national story is what holds us together. Every country needs a national story because in the end, we humans are a narrative species, right? We think about and store information in story form. We tell ourselves stories about who we are. Teenagers experiment with different stories about who they might be. We carry all of these identities, and it's in those structures that we make sense of the world. To ascribe ourselves to being members of something as abstract as a nation requires a compelling story, right? Whether we're in Japan or Hungary or Canada or the United States. But it becomes even more important when you don't have those other mythic things at your disposal, the building blocks of nationhood, which in a lot of other countries are a shared ethnicity, a shared religion, a shared history or imagined history going way back into time. So we've lived in this place since, the the mists of time fell over them and obscured them. Those things weren't available to the United States. And so the story becomes all important. Now, those two stories that exist that go back in time now several centuries, only one of them could possibly hold us together, right? The civic national story. The ethno-national one is inherently authoritarian because it makes the reductionist argument that only certain people among the residents of the United States are real Americans with full rights and others are here provisionally in some form or another. Again, it changes who's on the ins and outs and what religion and who's being targeted, but there's always somebody on the outside and somebody who the true Americans more tightly defined. And that's not a recipe that can hold the country together. Maybe in the 1920s, one could theoretically get away with that, but the diversity of the country is enormous. It simply is an impossibility and only a recipe for conflict and possibly even civil war to try to go down that path. What can hold us together and has held us together, especially from the 1960s onward for decades, was this notion that, yeah, we're committed to trying to perfect in difficult circumstances, trying to perfect a way that humans can live meaningfully free and secure this set of ideals that everyone ought to be entitled to. And that's, you need inspiring stories, and that is an inspiring story. It's one that, we haven't achieved those ideals, but, Frederick Douglass in every speech he made was saying, these are good ideals, you ought to try them, but you need to fight for them. And that's essentially the story that can hold us together. And, lots of people, I think a majority of Americans, if you sat down, you were able to have a conversation and ask the questions between the authoritarian model and its implications and the civic national one, and somehow separate it from people's partisan triggers, the supermajority of Americans everywhere would pick the civic national model, right? Probably 75, 80% of Americans would be on board for that. The number of people who actually want the ethno-national state is very small. So, yes, it can hold us together, but we've lost the ability to articulate that story. And that's why, one of the things that we do at Nationhood Lab is we're kind of testing and perfecting, actually doing polling and survey work and qualitative work to perfect how we talk about in the 21st century that civic national story, precisely because it's the one that can hold us together and, inspire us again to do great things.
Yeah, I want to pause and dig into that a little bit deeper. Both your work at Nation Lab and Nationhood Lab, and I think at American Promise, we also are telling a story for ourselves to relearn and to carry across the country, across partisan lines, across these regional and cultural lines of different regional divisions in the country. And we certainly find that what you just put your finger on, which is when asked, when tested,
Yeah.
when really engaged away from the partisan triggers, as you say, Americans actually want to believe and want to make real, not only for themselves, but for their fellow Americans, a story of freedom, equal rights, and self-government of we the people. I think Lincoln got that when he kind of redefined the American Constitution out of the Declaration of Independence and the Great Gettysburg Address. And if you want your American Promise Constitution, folks, let us know. We'll send you one. It includes the Gettysburg Address and the Declaration of Independence, which really hold that together. And the constitutional amendments that mark the milestones of American progress towards that promise, I think, are also incredibly important sort of data points for Americans, because they take 2/3 of Congress. It takes ratification of 38 states. Amendments really, by definition, have to be a national consensus. A significant regional objection is going to stop an amendment. And yet, when tested, Americans ratified amendments for women to vote, for equal voting, to end slavery, to end the poll tax, and right up until more recent times, lower the voting age to 18. Doesn't mean they're easy, but engaged Americans, and this story seems to cross these regions very effectively, not just historically, but today. And I think that's why we're seeing 86% and these kind of numbers and this kind of work across 22 states. And so to Ann Drum, who asked, what shared values do you think we should emphasize as we do cross-partisan advocacy. I want to come back in a little bit to what are the lessons for citizens trying to engage Americans in the work that needs to be done now. But could we sum it up as that sort of freedom, equality, and self-government? You call it civic national
Yeah.
story. What
Well,
what are the values, to Ann Drum's question, that really are shared?
yeah, it's the commitment to those propositions about humans, and that we all have a right to live. We have a right not to be tyrannized. We have a right to pursue our happiness as we understand it, and to access the representative self-government that makes it possible. And we're all pledged to protect one another's rights as Americans to these things, and to further a society where that's all possible. So yeah, it's equality and freedom and equal access to these things that make it possible. But
Yeah.
that's that was a revolutionary idea at the time, and it's still a struggle. America's shortcomings are all human shortcomings. We've had 5,000 years roughly of advanced human civilizations, and 4,800 at least of them have been authoritarian despotisms, and that was considered normal. Like, just the idea that individual humans would be free just wasn't even on the consciousness until 300-400 years ago at the earliest. So we haven't been doing it very long, and we're not very good at it yet, and it's a work in progress, but it's an amazing thing that it's even been possible, and that we've gotten as far as we have if you look at the great sweep of history.
Yeah. And it really is remarkable. And I think it can also be both daunting and encouraging to remember that, because, we are doing this big project together, and it's pretty phenomenal how it's, despite all the shortcomings, how well we've done considering the relatively low bar of human history.
Definitely.
But we
And
all, that
how
also,
delicate the edifice is, in a sense. I mean, I
yeah.
think the other thing that concerns me about it, right? I came out of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. That was where I was when I was studying as undergrad, and then I happened to be there in my exchange program when communism collapsed, and was saw those events, and then stayed through my 20s and through the 1990s, covering everything from the collapse of communism through the Bosnian conflict and so on. And that was sort of a laboratory for all the fragility of things, and the tragedy of history, and how easily tyrannies and despotisms from the right or left can pop up and all that. Most Americans don't have any of that tragic sense of history, right? There's this assumption that somehow we're, a special nation, that, the God waved a magic wand and we got freedom, and therefore we don't have to worry about it because it's sort of our birthright and will just happen. It's not, right? It's you gotta maintain and protect and fight for a free society, because in a certain sense, all the inertial and centripetal forces in the system are sending you in the other direction if you're not careful. It wants to spin apart, but holding it together is what creates the magic of having a free society.
Yeah. And I want to dig into a little bit now to the challenge of a story that people don't believe anymore. And I think we have seen civic trust collapse. I've cited a lot of numbers about this shared consensus, 86% and so on, backing the American Promise constitutional amendment approach to money and politics. But also behind that are clear data that right now most Americans think government has been captured by an elite donor class, by special interests, by global corporations, and that they're not represented. And so a coherent national story will only work if it's actually plausible to Americans. And I want to ask you, Colin, about your look at this history. And you might have talked about this in American Character or some of your other books, but this question of like a shared consensus that oligarchy is bad. We have the progressive income tax amendment and the after the Gilded Age. We have themes running through American history where Americans actually unite around the idea that economic prosperity and innovation and entrepreneurship is wonderful, but we also need to protect this fragile political project from economic forces as well. Can you say something about that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, my argument in American Character, which kind of dealt with these things, remember I said that, there's individual liberty and the common good. Those are two approaches to how to have a free society. If you run in the extreme in either direction, you end up in tyranny. That's the irony, right? You keep running down individual freedom, and eventually you end up, not in anarchist paradise, but rather the winners will take everything because no one's there to stop them and crush everybody else, right? The big dog eats the small dogs. You end up in, Guatemala under the 10 families, or El Salvador under the 7 families, or it's not a good thing. And you run in the other direction, you end up with Orwell, right? You keep going down the common good until the keepers of the common good start punishing idiosyncratic things. You end up with Stalin and Hitler and all the rest. So tyranny is on either side. So the answer is a liberal democratic society is running it when the two forces are in equilibrium. You need both to watch out for individual freedom and to secure, the common good. But the happy meeting optimized point is when those two forces are in balance, those two essential aspects of freedom. So to your question, in our country, we've shifted on one side or the other through our history, but my read as to how we got into this difficult state of affairs we're in now, where the whole project of freedom is now in question and rapidly becoming not insured, is that we ended up straying too far on one side. In this case, the individual liberty side, for 40 years, we kept changing the equations so that, yeah, the oligarchs started forming, that large corporations and individuals started having not just economic power, but undue political influence, and all the things that, you're concerned about American Promise absolutely happened. It broke the social contract. The notion that being meaningfully free requires that theoretically that somebody, when they're born, has a shot at being meaningfully free, at being able to achieve their potential and go out there and fight the meritocratic battle. If where you're going to end up in the great, the great may the best person win battle in America, if that's all determined by birth, that, what class you're born into or what family is going to decide almost everything, that's not a free society anymore, right? It's becoming less and less so. And I think that we ended up at the point where clearly, everything from the tax code to who doesn't go to prison for the same crimes is starting to fall on those kind of lines, and people know it. And that, the shocks first of 9/11 to our notion of security, of the forever wars, to the notion that the defense establishment and American power could solve anything anywhere. And then biggest of all, the 2008 financial meltdown discredited, the whole system. And that left people, feeling that the whole thing was sort of a lie. The social contract was broken that holds us together, and did, enough damage that we now are into the territory where we have to worry about, despotism and dictatorship rather than a battle over, hey, how do we build a free society? That's a
Yeah.
totally different thing. And absolutely, money in politics is one of the symptoms of slipping towards oligarchy or feudalism, away from a free society, because you're heading down that path towards the big dogs taking everything and nobody else being able to do much about it.
Yeah. Well, we certainly see as before as before in our history, Americans are ready to turn again to the constitutional amendment process to check and balance and recommit together to the American project of freedom and equal rights and self-government that works. So I want to ask you, Colin, we have millions of Americans who have voted in ballot initiatives and otherwise for this constitutional amendment. I mentioned many of the states at the outset of this call, where even just this morning in Pennsylvania, where we're getting winning votes, and they're Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And these American Promise is Republican, Democratic, and independent. And these states are in every one of your regions.
Yeah.
And so it seems we're doing something right. And I could try my hand at what works for helping Americans to engage across these sort of national boundaries, if you will, across these different regions and cultures of America. But you know this better than I do. Please share your wisdom. What for Americans out there who are tabling at fairs, or they're trying to do both local work and national work, for our meetings in Congress come June, where we'll be meeting with folks from every region of the country. How do we best communicate with each other? How do we respect each other? How do we engage Americans in doing something like this that does avoid those partisan triggers that you said is necessary to actually allow the
Yeah.
common story to be the one that holds us together, and we build this actual commitment to freedom and equality and self-government and not fall into oligarchy and tyranny.
Yeah.
What tips, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, you like a lot of issues in American life. I mean, you have super majorities agreeing with the amendment you're trying to put forward in all the regional cultures, almost everywhere. There's large majorities for all kinds of things, the sort of consensus on gun control, on reproductive issues, the observed difference in partisan behavior by electeds is much more extreme than if you actually poll people as to what they think, separated from their sort of tribal or partisan identities. So you have that working for you. And I mean, in our own experience, the sense that there's sort of an oligarchy forming powered, both the left and the right's, angry populist movements, both, Bernie and Donald, right? Both the Occupy movement and the Tea Party were driven by that, right? The Tea Party took off essentially because that reinsurer in Connecticut was going to get a bailout after almost bringing down the world insurance market, and they were going to get a bailout from taxpayers, and taxpayers realized it. That's when the Tea Party just went absolutely ballistic, not the CNBC presenter. And Occupy, of course, is motivated the same way. Bernie Sanders and Trump in 2016 had a lot of overlap in what they said. I, as a reporter during the 2016 cycle, would run into people here in Maine, and somebody would say, who are you thinking of supporting? He said, well, I don't know. I'm torn between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, they'd say during the primary season, because, that there's a sense that there's something wrong, and they both say they're going to do something about it. So yes, you have all of that to your advantage. The difference across regions often has to do with framing things. If you know some about the underlying value sets in the regional cultures, the way you'd approach your messaging is a little different. For instance, in gun control, or maybe even there's a way to do it in your constitutional amendment stuff. If you wanted to say, hey, this set of policies, say in gun control to have ban extended magazines, or assault rifles, or close loopholes and background checks. If you do this in Greater Appalachia, if you do this, it will help you protect your family. That's a winning argument. In Yankeedom, you could say, if you do this, it will make our communities safer. If you reverse those messages, they wouldn't do as well in either place. You're arguing for the same policies, but the way you frame the value set, it's true that we'll do both, but the way you frame it and the emphasis shifts. And I think that might be true in a constitutional amendment, right? This will guarantee your freedom and your children's freedom, as opposed to this will, ensure that, the society, our communities are not controlled by oligarchs. They lead to the same place, but just the messaging priority might be different.
Yeah, that's really important. We've certainly found that, and so I would underline that the vocabulary matters, the framing matters, but what we have found, you learn that, Nationhood Lab can help us learn that, but I think the other thing we found is listening actually helps to learn that, to not just lean in with your vocabulary, your culture, your nation, and try to just roll over other people, but actually step back, listen how the conversation's going, and you'll find some amazing common ground if you do.
Yeah, and the messenger after that, right? It doesn't need to be somebody from DC on high or a different regional culture coming and telling you. If it's a winning message, people within those regions who are credible leaders within any community, whether it's a region or another subset, who agree with you, are going to know how to talk about it and will credibly be part of that community.
Yeah,
It's a cacophony of voices in any movement to change things, and having the people on the ground who are of the place and speak it is the ideal in whatever you're trying to do, from constitutional amendments to ideals of your national narrative.
Yeah. So we have a little bit more time for questions, and we have lots in the chat. So I want to bring some of those in. Please feel free to put a question in the chat for Colin Woodard, or for me, which I'm going to take this one because Lori Friedman, thank you for your question. It is and there's a debate going on in the chat about a constitutional convention, whether that's a good idea, bad idea. The way to amend the Constitution under the Constitution's provision, Article 5, is Congress proposes 2/3 the amendment, and then the states, Usually the state legislatures consider ratification, and when 3/4 of the states ratify it, it is an amendment to the US Constitution, no convention. The Constitution also has a provision that has never been used, that 2/3 of the states could call a convention to propose an amendment, and then it still would go through the same ratification process. I think the idea at the beginning being that maybe Congress wouldn't actually do an amendment that was needed. Maybe Congress would become non-responsive, plausible to many Americans today. But I want to emphasize American Promise is doing what successful amendments have always done, which is take it to the American people. As Colin said, let people say it in their own language for their own reasons, with their own messengers. We're all in the same place, and we'll get, just like every other amendment, a 2/3 vote in Congress, ratification in 3/4 of the states, no convention. So if you're concerned about a convention, don't worry, you're in the right place. If you think a convention might be helpful, we're not going to criticize any American who wants to use constitutional processes to improve the country, because sometimes that push for a convention has lit a fire under Congress, and they've gotten amendments done, which is the reason we elect senators today. So there's room for everybody's strategy, and an American Promise. We're going to get this amendment done through Congress and the states without a convention, and letting the American people get it done. So, Lori, thank you for that question. Yes, thank you. Colin has put the Nationhood Lab website into the chat. Please check it out. We'll also be sharing with everybody who's signed on to this call links, including to Colin Woodard. So please do check that out. And then there's also in the chat lots of ways to get involved. Colin, I want to share a comment. There's lots of these, but I agree exactly with Colin. We need to refresh our sense of our value for freedom, especially what existed during the Cold War. We've lost our values, even our desire to have them. Let's pick up that last point. How do we remember that this is actually that the Nationhood Lab work is really important? How do we remember that we actually should want these values?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of people are disillusioned, especially young people. And we haven't articulated this value set in any coherent way since the end of the Cold War. I mean, we sort of gave up on it in 1989. There was it was seen not as a triumph of liberal democracy over authoritarianism, but rather of capitalism over communism. And then, free markets were going to save the world, and capital will move around. You can deregulate everything and it'll be wonderful. And nation states will evaporate and go away. Look at the EU. They're all forming up. It's a thing of the past. You don't need to worry about your national story because nations are going away. Of course, completely untrue, right? That was not what was happening. But during that time period, not only ourselves, but in Europe in their own way, and in other liberal democracies around the world, stopped talking about those things to our detriment. And as a void opened up, and as that, whatever you want to call it, the neoliberal consensus unraveled, 9/11, 2008, and all the rest, there was a void there that demagogues were able to step into. So yeah, it's really essential that we figure that out again. But so many people have grown up now with no counter story being created, and with the knowledge that the previous sanitized version of the story that was incorrect, that all kinds of people were being left out, that all kinds of terrible events from the Trail of Tears and the Tulsa race riots and all these other things were being concealed in the history books. And, we're really a depraved country. We're humans and we're plodding along. But because we haven't really addressed those things, we've kind of dug a bit of a hole for ourselves that we need to work our way out of. So yeah,
Right.
that's the big challenge. But I think it's possible because, that elements of that narrative I described are inspiring and are the things that pull us together. And they do transcend, a huge portion of our ideological spectrum all falls under that umbrella, including, most people from both parties and independents in between. So it has the real potential to do it, but people need to start figuring out how to talk about it again.
Yeah, you have about 45 seconds to answer this one, but I want to give the last question to your fellow Mainer, great farmer, Jim Garretson, who asks, Colin, how does the rural-urban divide, which is very real in America today, the very rural-urban divide interface with the American nations concept?
Yeah, so rural places and urban places are different around the world. Usually, rural ones are more conservative than the urban ones because of the nature of what they're trying to do. And you have a lot of stranded capital out there that's illiquid, and therefore, and you're subject to the weather and all kinds of other things. So you're more conservative about things, not as opposed to being an innovation, dynamic environment where you shift things around. But that said, the difference between the rural and urban is trumped by these regional cultures, all the way up at least through to 2016. For decades and decades, the data shows that, rural and urban counties voted alike for the same party in almost all the regions most of the time. In other words, rural places might be more conservative, but on aggregate in Yankeedom, rural places were voting Democratic, and still are, as in 2016 even. And urban places in aggregate in greater Appalachia vote Republican, still do. And you see that shift. Only the very biggest core counties of the major metropolises of, over 1 million people are the exception, that they're always blue blots. Everywhere else, suburban, rural, and such, shifts around with their regions. So, that, yes, they're different, but it's a mistake to think that that's the fundamental lasting difference in our politics. I will say, though, that Trumpism has capitalized on a certain type of grievance in a lot of rural areas in certain regions of the country, especially the Midlands and Yankeedom, that has that ethno-nationalism has allowed him to make gains in some of these regions where an individual liberty approach was a non-starter. And so it has shifted a little more, but I think that's weather more than climate based on the long track record going back.
All right, we are out of time. We're going to leave it there. To get involved in continuing and preserving and strengthening the fragile but beautiful project of American democracy, and uniting and stitching together these very different cultures and nations of America that Colin is talking about, please sign up at AmericanPromise.net. Please check out Colin Woodard's work at the Nationhood Lab. The website is in the chat. It's nationhoodlab.org. Big thank you to Colin Woodard for his path-breaking work that's so important to all Americans. And Colin, we're very grateful to you. This is being recorded. We will send out the recording with the links to all. So tell your friends, and we'll be sure they'll get a recording as well. Thank you to everyone for your good work out there, for joining us tonight. And we'll see you on our next leadership series conversations coming soon. Colin, thank you so much. Great to talk with you.
Thank you all. Pleasure.
Take care now.